Leading to Here. Extraordinary stories from everyday leaders.
Welcome to Leading to Here. This is a podcast series where we spend a little time with some of the amazing people we've met and worked with at Think in Focus over the last 8.5 years, as we help individuals, teams and businesses get out of their own way. I'm Rich, and with me is Ricky.
Hello, everybody.
And our guest today is Laura Kerby, a dynamic and visionary leader who inspires others to make things happen. Laura is an experienced CEO and executive board member, a strategic and analytical thinker who shapes organizations' directions. Laura is the CEO of Prostate Cancer UK and, amongst other things, a very keen supporter of West Ham United. Laura, welcome.
Hi, Rich. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. We better not talk West Ham after the weekend.
Well, I don't know. Was it that? Well, maybe. I don't know. Okay, let's not get into that, perhaps. Just wondered, Laura, as we get going, if you'd just briefly share a little bit about your current role and the charity that you're working for.
Yeah, so I am the Chief Executive of Prostate Cancer UK, and Prostate Cancer UK is a charity that is there to raise awareness of prostate cancer, to research different ways of treating and detecting prostate cancer, and fundamentally support men. So when men do have a diagnosis of prostate cancer, they can get specialist nurse services and health information from us. So we do a 360 degree package around men. And we're very, very passionate about supporting them to get the best and advocate for them to get the best out of healthcare for them.
Okay, thank you. So we will come back to your current role as we work through this conversation this morning. But what we like to do is to go back a little bit and try and find out sort of what makes you tick and what are the reasons that you took this career path, what led you to here, essentially. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. Tell us a little bit, Laura, if you don't mind. What was growing up like? What was family life like for you, and what was school like? How did you get on there?
Yeah, so family life, I've been really lucky in that I have a tremendously supportive family. I am a middle child, which I think always makes people smile, but mum and dad were always very loving, always really gave us space to explore as kids.
Yeah.
And I guess as a middle child, I obviously had to be better than my elder sister. And when my little brother came along, that created other competitiveness, I think, in me, which I think really was my childhood. I was a good sports person. Sport really did dominate my life, I guess, as a young person.
You're playing lots of sport then?
Yeah, so hockey, netball, cross country, running were definitely, going to the athletics track. It was a bit of an obsession of mine. And I guess probably, as we all are, as a child, I was good at it. So because I was good at it, then I was very comfortable in that space. But I think sport for me taught so much about working in teams, communication, leadership out on the field, both as an individual and as a captain, which I was very lucky to be. But I think that was really it. And I think, my mum and dad were very good at supporting my sporting efforts, probably to the detriment of my education, which didn't go particularly brilliantly.
Right.
And always sort of created that platform to just have a go, go and have a go, follow your dreams a bit, try and make it happen. So I was very lucky, very fortunate, I think, to have such a wonderful upbringing.
Had they been particularly sporty, your parents, or was it just something that and did your brother and sister, did you say you got a brother and sister, didn't you? Did they do it as well, or was it just something for you that you got into?
So Dad was a mad cricketer, and also he used to take me out. So I was a big football player. So I was, football in women's football has grown extraordinarily. I won't give you my age, but let's just say 35 years ago, it didn't really exist. I used to have to, I couldn't play in the boys' team at school. I wasn't allowed to play, in any way, shape, or form. And so Dad used to spend hours and hours out on the field, kicking a football with me, and I used to play with the kids out in the road. So he was he used to take me everywhere, running and all the rest of it. And he used to always help with the nerves at the beginning, because I always got very nervous before I performed, and always the celebration at the end. So I think, that's what it was. My sister and my brother, less so, to be honest. It was very much my niche, I guess, that I cut out. And then the football thing, because we might as well. So, not only did I have wonderful parents, I had wonderful grandparents, and my granddad, who was a black taxi cab driver, took me to the bowling grounds, Upton Park. I was about 7 years old, and West Ham just became a real part of my life. Didn't understand what was going on, but it was the most exciting thing I've ever been to. And having East End parents and East End grandparents, I think, has featured both in terms of the way I lens life. Often things get thrashed out over a good old cup of tea. And I know that might sound very, unexciting, but that's often what happens. And that resilience, which I think comes a little bit with that, well, you've got to get on with it. You've got to get on with life. That sort of slight East End mentality, which is, resilience. And, I think that has been enormously helpful as a tenant in my life.
Wouldn't the world, Laura, be a much better place if we could just sort it out with a cup of tea?
It would be, wouldn't it be? But I think there is that. It's that communication, and it's thrashing things through. I think my mum and dad's motto very much was, problem shared is a problem halved, and I think that's probably the case. But it did mean not a lot went unspoken in our household. I think, but always with that view of getting on with it. So, how did you solve the problem, or how did you remove the barrier, as opposed to dwelling on the problem,
on the issue?
Yeah.
So there was a strong family community, strong, almost a stoic nature about things, of how you're going to deal with things. You talked a lot there about sport. So obviously you played a load of sport and learnt lots from that and the family values. What about when you moved on from school then? What were you, had you got dreams of going into playing some sort of sport, being an athlete of some kind, or where was your mind at that point?
I think the thing that always surprises people when I talk to people, because they see me as I am today, perhaps rather than my 19-year-old self. But I became a fitness instructor. So I left school at 18 and moved into an industry which at the time, was very much, you needed to have a lot of money to go to a health club. It was very much country club style. Nobody did direct debits. It wasn't easily accessible. And I became a fitness instructor and spent the first sort of year or so of my career literally showing people how to use machines to keep, for weights and treadmills and everything else. So I really did start with sport. But I think one of the things that through sport was the building of that leadership, because I guess I had always, as part of sport, been ambitious for a team. I'd always been positive with a team, even if we lost. And I'd always played a sort of leader role. So I think in sport, even when I went into fitness, you had to motivate people towards a goal fundamentally, and if your goal is losing weight, how do I motivate you towards that goal? So I think while sport played a considerable, and still does in my life, it was already that getting after an ambition, a vision that was either mine or somebody else's, and helping people get there.
That must have been, I suppose you wouldn't have known it at that point, but you're laying some real foundations there for, senior leadership work in terms of motivation, in terms of perhaps even helping people see a vision that they didn't know was there. Did you have any difficult clients back then, that kind of said, I want to lose weight, but didn't want to put the work in, or that kind of stuff?
Yeah, plenty. So, people want the magic pill, right? We all want the magic pill. That means we can just take it. We don't have to really put ourselves through the stress and strains of exercise. I think what it really taught me was, there is such a broad spectrum of people. I think you have to take people as individuals. And, it's very easy to start stereotyping. But when you're actually working with people on fitness, they're quite vulnerable. You'd have, guys who would have views of being very strong, but really worried they weren't as strong as the guy that was pumping weights next to them. So really working with people on that, you feel a bit vulnerable. It's you might have, just because you might be very successful in business or very successful in your career or life, it doesn't necessarily mean that sport's for you. But, so it's it does level the playing field quite a bit. So you really have to get into that coaching side, I think, of what are motivations, and being prepared to set realistic goals rather than romantic goals that nobody is actually really going to achieve and be disappointed.
That's like me trying to get the six pack. It's never going to happen. Never going to happen.
Well, not with that attitude, it's not, Ricky, is it?
No, I'm playing with Laura's realism as opposed to romanticism. It's just not going to happen. Not at my time of life.
And you don't need it, Ricky. That's the good news. You don't need to have a six pack just to keep yourself generally fit and well. But lots of people do get those visions in their heads.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? About when you mention that you got the guy trying to sort of justify himself against the person next to him, and how society makes us do that and think that equals success or that equals fitness or whatever it might be.
Yeah, often, rather than just that, general sense that you can prevent disease, which is going to, cause you major problems just by regularly exercising, as opposed to wanting to turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. He was an interesting leader himself, isn't he?
He was indeed,
Yeah.
What an interesting thing it would have been if he'd had US citizenship. Perhaps we wouldn't quite be where we are, but I'll leave that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That really would be interesting. Maybe we should try and get him on Leading to Here, Ricky. We'll have to try and get some connections there. So at what point then in your career, so it sounds like now you're working, you're actually learning lots, you're enjoying it. At what point did you start to think about leading other people or managing other people or getting into that kind of more official role?
Yeah, a very young age, actually. And the reason for that was that I was lucky. I joined an industry that was about to boom. And I didn't know that. I did it because I love sport, and being a fitness instructor made sense for me rather than going on to university, in simple terms. But in the boom and acceleration of that industry, you became a specialist really quickly at a very young age, and health club management became really accessible because there just wasn't that many people that understood or could do it. Because, and literally, as the David Lloyds of the world, and and Nuffers of the world, and all the other gym chains started to come on board, the opportunity for career acceleration and enhancement was huge. So I got given, really, I guess, a choice. At 21, I was quite young. In fact, that does feel very young thinking about it now. But anyway, did I want to carry on specializing basically in instructing, i.e., finding out more about physiology, physical, resistance, how do you work, or did I want to go into management? And I decided that I wanted to go into management. And at that stage, I think, whilst I loved the specialism, I really realized that I had an ability to think logically, to put plans together, to get after ambition, and people would migrate to me. Without, I hope that doesn't sound arrogant. It's not, I just noticed that I was able to do that. And so I became a health club manager at the age of 21, and I became a regional manager at the age of 23 for a large hotel chain at the time, Forte. That's Forte for anybody that remembers them. Who are now, who went through a series of iterations. But, and I was looking after, all of a sudden, at the age of 23, 25 health clubs across the UK. And it was wonderful. They gave me a Rover car. I remember it was the most exciting thing I've ever had. And a Nokia phone, which was like a brick. But notwithstanding that, that opportunity then not only to lead, but to lead disparately. So how did you do that then when you didn't actually have the people working with you every single day? How did you motivate managers that were in different locations across the UK? How did you create presence? How did you create,
So how did you then, Laura? Go on to explain a little bit, because
I think to begin with, It was very much, I drove around the country in my Rover car and literally got in front of as many people as I possibly could.
Yeah.
And I think it was a combination of, again, being very clear what I wanted the region to do. So clarity for me is a really key part. Data is really important. So making sure we had the right data sets so that we could make the right decisions that we needed to make. So I could also demonstrate to people that, you know, there was an objectivity in making the decisions that we did. And then just really loving health and fitness. So, you know, going in, and because I had been an instructor, really being able to resonate with those that were trying to do it because I'd been in their shoes, and, you know, that love and passion for your subject and your topic, I think really does make a difference to people when they're working for you as a leader.
Laura, tell me about, because I think remote management, disparate management, as you described it, is probably the hardest there is. Because, like you say, you can't see what's going on. You can't go and check it out. You could be the the opposite end of your territory or whatever it might be. So, how did you manage the piece? And this is more for my benefit as much as anything, but how did you manage the piece where you would walk away thinking you've landed your message, only to find out that they perhaps not embraced it in the same passion and energy that you had? How did you cope with that? How did you manage that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I always work on the basis that people come to us to do their very best for you. So I think I've
Mm.
always had that very, you know, I think I don't see people coming to work trying to, you know, get away with things. Or I genuinely think that people try their best. I think things can get in the way of that, but I think fundamentally that's why, you know, especially in the industry, in the health and fitness industry, and in the medical industry, which I'll talk about a little later, because obviously I moved into healthcare.
Mm.
But to answer your question directly, Ricky, I think you just have to be relentless. So, you know, you have to have tenacity, you have to have that resilience, perhaps I was talking about earlier, in that you know, you need to make sure you are that beat of a drum. This is what I'm looking for. This is why I'm looking for this. Why is really important. You know, it's not just what, it's this is why this would make a difference to the business. And then I guess monitoring with good will and good faith. So it's not your numbers say this, so what, you know, what on earth's going on? You know, you need to do better. It's, you know, noticing trends, having a conversation, really trying to make sure it's clear you see it, but
Yeah.
you're enabling the person to do something about it.
Yeah.
Ooh, right, okay. Really interesting. Couple of things that I think you've talked about there. So let me try and recap a little bit. So clarity. So
Yep.
ensuring that people know what's expected of them, what you're trying to do together as a team, I'm
Yep.
assuming. Yeah.
Yep.
You talked about making sure you've got the right information at hand, the right data to be able to make the right decisions.
Yep.
And then you mentioned a phrase there, which I just asked you to elaborate on: the beat of a drum. What did you mean about being the beat of a drum?
So I think sometimes as a leader, you can feel very repetitive. You think, oh, I've said this. I've already said this.
Mm.
You know, why haven't people listened? But I think if you work from a premise that people will not always absorb the information or will interpret the information in a different way, and therefore you have to keep that message and give slightly different versions of it to try and reach the different ways in which people take on information, or the way people like to hear information or see information or understand information.
Yeah.
So for me, is that sort of continuous, the beat of the drum is, this is what I'm telling you, and these are the reason why, and I might tell you it over here slightly differently, but I'm still telling you why this is important.
Yeah.
And I think it's really easy to come off that, particularly in today's society when there is so much to filter with social media and everything else that's there. But I think you can cut through if you become what I call, and I talk to the team about this all the time, this sort of congruence. Our actions and behavior absolutely marry our words. If we say something but we don't see it in our actions and behavior, then nobody will believe us.
Yeah.
So that congruent message, that, you know, not only is it about words, but it's also about the way in which we role model.
Yeah, Laura, we subscribe to that entirely, because the work that we do all over, we kind of say this, you know, until you're bored of the message, they're only just starting to connect with the
Yeah.
message. So actually, if you give up too soon, then all that effort, all that hard work is lost. So, and I think the reality is, certainly in the role that you do, is and the roles that you've done before, you cannot stop giving that message. And I think that backing that up with your actions and behaviors is fundamental, because that's the truth. That's the moment of truth that says we're serious, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes, Ricky, that's really underestimated as to how much hard work it is, because it doesn't feel like hard work. It feels like,
Hmm.
it can feel a little mundane. It can feel like, oh, I'm banging on about this again. But it is interesting. And you also have to remember, and I certainly, in terms of Prostate Cancer UK, we have uh, 18% turnover staff. Now that's relatively low and it's something we're quite proud of, but that's still quite a lot of new people coming
Hmm.
that you're then bringing them on this kind of strategy with you or vision with you, and they're only hearing it for the first time, and they can then add massive value as new people coming into the organisation if they understand it.
Leading to Here. If you're a leader and have a story to tell, reach out at hello@thinkingfocus.com.
Just changing tack slightly, because you've at this point in your career you've moved into leading a region. So there's a number of people that you're now kind of leading and hoping to motivate and inspire. Please inform myself and Ricky, as two middle-aged white men, what was this like for a woman? Because I'm assuming there were many barriers you got to overcome, not just in the clarity of message and the beat of the drum, but also maybe the preconceptions that people had got about you at that time.
And I think that would come in two ways. A, you know, the female element, but also your age as well. That might have played against you as well.
Yeah, so I think where that probably played out a little bit more was when I got more senior onto boards, if I'm honest, in terms of
Mm,
where I think at that stage, I felt in my career, I was only 23, I was doing really well. I was winning, for want of a better word. And because I was so passionate about my subject matter, it sort of trumped other things. I think
right.
where being a woman became, and we were operating. So where becoming a woman becomes potentially, you have to think more about the barriers potentially that you're trying to overcome, is when you're trying to influence much more in those senior roles. You're trying to influence and shape strategy or vision or ambition, as opposed to delivering. So at that stage, I would say I was delivering. And I can talk a bit about that, Rich, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating because I've not heard anyone mention that before. How that bias might affect the difference between operating and influencing. So please, Laura, yeah.
Yeah, I think, without making it stereotypical in any way, shape, or form, I think, when women are enacting tasks, we're seen as very, very useful, because we're good at it. We're good at getting stuff done, and we can be a bit bossy sometimes, and all those sorts of things that perhaps stereotypically we
Yeah,
get attached to. And I don't subscribe to all of that, but just
yeah,
to paint a bit of a picture. I think when you're on a big board, so moving into Nuffield Health, and you're on a board where it's predominantly male, and you are trying to influence much bigger decisions about where money is being spent,
yeah.
investment, or where organisational direction should be. I think that's where, as a woman, you are challenged with one of two things. One, either becoming uh, feeling like you have to become much more like a male mentality, in
Right.
terms of doing that bit bigger, putting a suit on, being more competitive, getting your elbows out, all those sorts of things, which I don't think is the way to do it, incidentally. But there's an element of, you feel you might need to move in that direction.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that you have to find back channels. I think you have to work your back channels much, much harder uh,
Mm.
than you have to do if you are a man in this particular instance, because you have to get listened to, and you have to find ways of getting listened to, which invariably was before you got to the meeting, because in the meeting, often it was very difficult to cut through.
So you'd done quite a bit of your influencing outside the room, and around the organisation before you'd got into the meeting room and the decision point.
Yeah, that was the biggest thing I learned, that perhaps I want to say out loud that Nuffield Health, I had some wonderful mentors, male mentors,
Yeah.
and some great support around me. So I'm not saying, I really don't want to kind of cast dispersion in any way, shape, or form.
No.
But I think you just recognise that in the actual meeting, sometimes the loudest voices were very rarely coming from female quarters.
So let's move into Nuffield then. So you went there around about 1999.
Yeah.
Um, what was your first role? What were you doing there? Because you then, as you've alluded to already, you moved all the way through to the board. So take us on a little journey there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So um, we actually went into Nuffield because we were bought. So we were a small organisation that were doing at the time corporate wellbeing. So what this was going into blue chip companies across the UK and giving them not only exercise solutions but also wellbeing solutions. So nutrition,
Yeah.
psychological kind of support, and we had a really good portfolio. Again, I always talk about lucky, but literally I walked into this organization, started this organization as Canary Wharf was going up, and every single
Mm,
organization on Canary Wharf, whether it was KPMG, JP Morgan, HSBC, all wanted the best of the best, kind of well-being provision.
yeah.
Plus, we were starting to get far greater evidence about the implication of well-being on productivity within, and results within organisations. If you keep your people well and well
Yeah.
looked after, you'll get greater presenteeism and productivity. So that organisation got bought into Nuffield, and at that stage, we genuinely the people that went into the organisation with me, we kind of thought that we would just be eaten up and we would all end up being made redundant. That's the truth of the matter. But the
Right.
opposite happened. We were seen as the new strategy coming into Nuffield that was going to create what was a hospital division just doing treatment into a preventative treatment
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
well-being provision, and we were the catalyst for changing the ambition and proposition for the organization. As a result of that, I got invited to take on primary care and physiotherapy at Nuffield, which, as you can imagine, had some bearing with fitness, because it's about understanding people's mental and physical state in terms of
Mm,
primary care, doctors, and screening. And physiotherapy, obviously, from the physical side of things, the rehabilitation and prehabilitation side of things as well. But I had never run such, an organisation with such a different group of practitioners.
yeah.
And I think this is where I would say that I had to really pivot my leadership. I started working with people who are older than me at this stage, so
Right.
doctors who perhaps
Yeah.
were in their 40s and 50s, and I was sort of in my mid 30s at that stage. People with clinical views, which were very
Yeah.
strong, that I didn't necessarily understand because it was science. And so it was a real challenge in that space. But I think, again, because I had a vision on where we should go, which was shared by the organization, it was then really about listening to these people, listening to what they had to say, and really, and I think you'll use the word at the beginning, galvanizing them. How do I help them uh, come along the journey and shape it with us, as
Mm,
opposed to saying, oh no, that won't work because this is what clinical says, or this is what science says, or this is what, this is how we should be doing physiotherapy. And I think my success on that, on bringing that group of clinicians on,
yeah.
I became a really important conduit for Nuffield, because I was sort of the integrated bridge between
Yeah.
well-being and medicine. And that role, which I loved, because it comes back to, everything I've done in my career, I've really done it because I've wanted to do it and I've loved doing it, as opposed to because I wanted to be a big leader or I wanted to
Yeah.
earn
Yeah.
money. But playing that bridging role then all of a sudden became incredibly valuable to Nuffield, and my career started to accelerate really quickly, because fundamentally I could talk to different people in different languages. I became like a translator, and that had value.
It sounds, Laura, as well, that you. It sounds like, and you mentioned it right at the end, I think, there, that this was not an egotistical thing. Actually, you were being quite vulnerable because you were aware of what you didn't know. You were aware that there were other experts around you were working with, and you felt, and again, I'm putting words in your mouth here, so please correct me, but if you felt like it was your role to find a way through that to help people achieve the goals that you kind of collectively got, and would you say that served you in good stead as you've gone through your career?
Um, Whether it's vulnerability, I think it's curiosity. I'm just
Right.
really
Yeah.
interested in all of this. When I've come into Prostate Cancer UK, I'm really interested in, how does the research go? I went to a conference in California last week. I probably understood a third of it, but I'm
Right.
fascinated by all this, this what could the future be like? I guess I'm quite future focused. It's like it's exciting, what could the art of the possible.
Yeah.
So I would say driven probably more by curiosity than vulnerability. However, in order to create relationships, you have to demonstrate vulnerability. You have to be prepared to say, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But I do know
Yeah.
a lot of people who do know what the answer is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess for some people that's perhaps trickier than I've found it for myself.
Yeah, because I think we often work with leaders who feel like it's their responsibility to know the answer. And I guess in some cases it might be, but in lots of cases it's not. Lots of cases it's their responsibility to be curious, try and work out the answer and get good people around them that can think things through. And often this belief that I'm the leader, I must have the answer can get in their way.
And I've experienced that. I know that in myself, where I've said, okay, I have to be, I have to be the leader.
Mm,
I have to, there is tremendous pressure in that. And I think there's times, Rich, where you actually have to do that. You do have to sort of step into what I call the kind of far more CEO space to, whether it's a crisis or whether there's reputational
mm,
issues or whatever it is, where you say, right, okay, I need to now to be quite autocratic, which
mm,
isn't my kind of DNA. It's probably much more to be collaborative. But there is pressure. There is pressure on leaders to get it right. There is, pressure on results. There is pressure on achievement, because I think that's the lens to which society and stakeholders and shareholders still judge. It still comes
yeah.
down to, are you could be the best leader in terms of people, but not get results, and people would still therefore attribute that as not succeeding.
Mm, absolutely, yeah. And you mentioned here now that your career, because you become this conduit, your career at Nuffield really started to accelerate. So what happened then? What positions did you find yourself moving through, and what were you learning at this point?
Yeah, so I moved very rapidly into, from looking after doctors, screening, physiotherapy, into looking after all of that, but 144 fitness and wellbeing centres as well. So I ended up with a business at the time. It was a £150 million business with a £14 million EBITDA. I don't know why I remember that, because it was 10 years ago now. But anyway, and everything that came with that very, very big role. And to your point, that's where you start to feel those pressures. And I think some of the pressures that you start to feel is having come through smaller organizations, is you are heavily reliant on the people that you surround yourself with. Because at the end of the
Mm,
day, they have both the information and they have the ability to make things happen. And I think I struggled with that for a bit, that, the not necessarily building a good team around me, because I think I was always relatively good at skills and experience and the sorts of people I wanted to
yeah.
work with me, but just letting go, I guess. I think to begin with, I microed a lot more than I do
Mm,
today. I don't think I particularly micro at all. And that's a learning, right? Because it all feels so out of control. How can I possibly know what's
mm,
going on all the time? And yet, if I don't know what's going on all the time, how am I going to be able to spot risk, mitigate risk, spot opportunity, make opportunity happen? And that was a heavy learning for me, and something which I think I still have to practice today, probably.
But I think that comes from this, and I think it certainly in my experience, and certainly the leaders that I've worked with, coached, it feels like a rite of passage that you go through this kind of feeling, this sense that you need to be the font of all knowledge, you need to have an answer when they come to it. And certainly the pivotal moment in my career was the advent of coaching starting to really become the mainstream. Was I don't have to have the answers. All I've got to do is learn how to ask great questions. And to your point around that curiosity, that was a real watershed moment in my leadership career, because you can go, I don't know, show some vulnerability. What do you think? How might we do this together type stuff?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, pressures on leaders with coaching has shifted. And I think there is a much greater understanding of it is a collective. However, as you all know, Ricky and Rich, on an ongoing basis, a lot of the time the decision will get escalated back up. And sometimes you feel you're playing ping pong with saying, okay, well, you can escalate it to me, but I'm going to push it back down. So I need you to come with a recommendation, or I need you to come with some thinking before we have that conversation. But I think we are put into that position a lot. And I think it becomes almost automatic to then, somebody brings you something and you try and solve it, or you try and work it out. So, I think, yeah, coaching, it does help. I think it helps both the people around you recognize that as CEO, they need to work with, and they need to make offers, I guess, and of what they can do. And it is a collective effort. But from my perspective, it always gets attributed to the leader. It's, often the CEO becomes the caricature, if you like, of the organization, and therefore it must be down to their leading and the way they're doing it ultimately. And as I've said to lots of people, the organizations I've left, the story of my leadership will be told by the people that are there. I have very little influence on that narrative. So I guess to a certain extent is, what do I want that narrative to be? And it's about being a leader with ambition for an organization, being enthusiastic and positive, but also huge amounts of integrity and working with values.
When did you start to become cognizant of thoughts like that one that you've just shared there? Because I think quite often on a leadership journey, people get into leadership and they've not really done that thinking about, who am I? Why should I be leading anyone? And you sort of called it there as your story that's left behind. At what sort of stage in your career did you start to think about those sorts of questions, or did it just come naturally?
No, it didn't come naturally. I really struggled with it. And so when I left Nuffield, I very much felt that I could have done another job in healthcare, but it would have been very much what I'd already done, if that makes sense. I'd already done sort of, why would I want to go and do the same thing again? And so I decided to go into the voluntary sector. So this was a move from the commercial sector into the
Yep.
voluntary sector. And I decided to go into cancer, because working in healthcare, for me, was one of the big needs that wasn't being addressed as well as it could be, was my view, especially
Okay.
having done screening for quite some time.
Yeah.
So I went from a large organization into my first charity. And I remember when I went to see some headhunters and speak to some recruitment agencies, they said, oh, don't think you're going to come out of a big commercial job and go and run Macmillan. Don't think that. That's not going to happen. So I said, okay, well then where do I need to start? And they said, you need to start a little bit, more grassroots, and go and take a smaller charity, which I did.
Yeah.
When I went to that charity, which is called Pennybron UK, its culture was completely at the extremity of Nuffield. So everything that was in that commercial culture that was valued wasn't valued at all at Pennybron. What was valued at Pennybron was far more, looking after people with cancer, the mission, the, care,
Okay.
the way in
Yeah.
which we work, and me having a conversation about something like brand, for them was just sort of an alien language.
Did they struggle with that and almost find it, why are you talking about that? That's not as important as our purpose. Did they
Correct.
struggle to make that right? Yeah.
Yeah, we all struggled with it a little bit. So at that stage, I decided, and I can tell you now because I've studied it, but it was that change in habitus, that change from one environment to the other environment that I was struggling with. At that stage, I decided to do a master's in people and organisation at Roffey Park. And
Yeah.
I spent 2 years fundamentally studying my own leadership, including videoing myself in meetings, including, writing journals, and really trying to get under the skin of what had happened at Nuffield. So some of the things that had been left with me from Nuffield, beliefs, around leadership, how it works, how it operates.
Yeah.
And then this new environment to which I found myself, and how did I integrate those two things together? So the answer to your question, Rich, is that I've done huge, deep looking at my own leadership. And that was in discomfort. It wasn't really, it wasn't really because I wanted to all of a sudden become this amazing leader. It was, oh, hang on a minute. I thought I knew how to lead. Now I've got this other, now I'm not sure that I do know how to lead. So I went and did a deep dive and learned a huge amount about myself, about leadership in general, and then have brought that into my practice and hopefully the way in which I support my team in jobs. And interestingly, I was chatting to my coach about this. Prostate Cancer UK probably is got that commercial and purposeful. It probably is a great example of needing that integration.
Laura, what was your biggest realization from that self-reflection, that study that you did? Because I think that's brilliant. I went and did an MSc in people and management, but actually I was studying me. And I thought that was brilliant. But what was your biggest realization?
I think my biggest realization was that I had learnt a leadership style that worked for a particular environment, and that was quite hierarchical, because I sat in a hierarchical organization where when you're at the top, it was very much more of a a little command and control, not always, because when you're working with expertise, clinicians, you can't really run it like that, because you have to be able to embrace the expertise that's coming that you can't possibly have. But it was very much more, it went down through the ranks. That hierarchy was the way it worked. That's how decisions got made around here, those sorts of things. And so I really challenged that. I found myself looking far more at how do you take, and I hate the word followership because I genuinely hate it, because it makes it sound like everybody is sort of lemmings to a certain extent. I don't believe that. But actually, what the people that are coming with you, if you want to put it in those terms, what do they have to value? What do they have to offer? How do you embrace that? Is it really a top tier down, or is it a much more sideways model that you're actually working with? And I think, one of the things I really learned, or self-realization, was, I am part of this system, and my role is setting up the conditions as the CEO to try and make it work, as opposed to I'm in control. Now, setting up those conditions is really interesting, because I'm still working on that, and I'm not pretending, Ricky, that I've got this all sorted by any means of the imagination, but concentrating on the conditions that I have to set up.
And I think that's that conditions piece, and we talk about that a lot. Richard and I have done loads of work, again, with organizations talking about these conditions for success. But the thing is, the conditions that made you successful last year aren't necessarily the same conditions that are going to make you successful next year, because we're in a what's the term? VUCA, isn't it? Volatile and uncertain, complex, etc. We're in that VUCA world where the dynamic is shifting, and that will affect certainly your current sector, as well as every sector. We're all affected by some of those, seismic events that are beyond anybody's sometimes foresight, let alone control.
Yeah, and I think, you're absolutely right. The chances are there will be another seismic issue, catastrophe, if you want to call it that, or something will happen, whether that's economically, whether that's in society, that will have a bearing. And I think agility needs to be defined. I think agility in organizations where it's not defined can just mean everybody's just doing whatever they want to do. But agility with a proper definition on pivoting, how do we change, how do we make sure that we are semi-structured so that we can move, I think is really important. And I think for an organization of our size, that's much easier, because we're 250 odd people. As in big organizations, I think that is very tricky.
If you enjoy Leading to Hear, listen to our sister podcast, The Question Is, by Thinking Focus.
Tell us a little about how you manage this transition at Penny Brown then, because you mentioned very much focused on the purpose of the organization. The culture was very much on that. And you almost wanted to give them another dimension. So how did that journey go? Because it sounds like that wouldn't have been an easy transition that you helped them make.
No, but I also knew that Penny Bron needed to start thinking more commercially because the ambition that it had in order to help people with cancer, it wasn't going to reach if it didn't raise money. It wasn't going to
Yeah.
achieve if it didn't start taking income generation as a serious topic, as an opposed to an aside on purpose. So
Yeah.
I think this being in the voluntary sector, there's a lot of talk about social heart, commercial head, and I think
Yeah.
that's probably right. You need both. And so I think over time, I was at Penny Bron for 6 years, I started to bring in initiatives that to begin with were resisted, but because they started to work, people recognized that we could do more for people with cancer. We could, run more courses or have more counselors or have more nutritionists. It's those proof points, isn't it? I think proof points are really important in leadership, in that if you set out a direction, but it's just a dream because you never really get there, however wonderful that is, however poetic and romantic that is, ultimately people will not come alongside. Whereas if you set it out and then you start to take steps and you can prove those steps that you've made, particularly in income generation, I think in the voluntary sector, that says, well, if we don't earn, then we can't do what we want to do, then I think you can start to create change.
So those
I think
proof points and quick
proof,
wins and
proof point,
things
quick
like that.
wins. Yeah, and quick wins are always, everybody loves a quick win. Of course we do. But actually, you need to get beyond that, because I think the quick wins often, they are obvious to people. Well, not always, but they can be obvious to people. But actually, it's the mid. I always say when you hit about the 3rd or 4th year, that's really where you will demonstrate as a leader whether you've worked this out or not. Because you've got you've gone in, you've done your induction, you've got your knowledge, you've got your team on board, you've started to put together your vision. But now at this stage, you really need to start. The belief will come whether you start to deliver or not, in very simple terms.
And I think that's really interesting, because actually that's what separates a good leader, a good CEO, is the ability to hold their nerve when all around them are going, really? We're not seeing this kind of play out the way you're seeing it. So there's a real leap of faith that needs to come in, and that's where your commitment to action, commitment to cause, and making the team confident that we're on the right path. So it is those little proof points along the way that almost add up to, oh, when we look back, we did do it, almost, as opposed to there's this, because there's never a big bang that says switch flicked and all of a sudden everything's great. It's an accumulation of things over time, isn't it?
Yeah, I entirely agree. And that comes back to this beat of a drum. So if you're beating that
Yeah.
drum and saying, okay, guys, this is where we want to go. So in Prostate Cancer UK, we need a national screening program. Okay, so that's what we need for men. So everything is being geared towards trying to make that happen. But you've got to demonstrate, that's not going to happen overnight. What are the things that we need to do? We need to get out in the media. We need to start getting our narrative right. We need to start demonstrating the research that would be needed to do that, etc., etc. But you are absolutely right, Ricky, in terms of, I think every CEO, if they're honest, hits a place where they have to be stubborn somewhere, and it's a tricky one, because sometimes you think, am I being stubborn because I'm just being stubborn and I'm not prepared to pivot, or am I being stubborn because I genuinely believe we're on the cusp of doing something and it's too early to start pulling away? And I remember a very wise person once told me that the trick to leadership, and this was a great leader actually, who mentored me, is just to make more right calls than wrong calls.
Yeah.
So it wasn't about, it was about, always just make sure you make, the 60-40, Laura, get 60% calls there or thereabouts, and 40% just accept you're going to get them wrong. And then from that perspective, you can be a little bit more, that's how you start to look at your career, and you can relax a bit on the what's right, what's wrong type of thinking.
Yeah, and getting it right all the time. I wonder with that conversation there that we just had, um, the fact that you don't quick wins are not always the thing, and you talked about the third or fourth year. I wonder whether there's a conversation with West Ham United there, Laura, that you or in fact in fact football in general, and it's a flippant comment, but what you do often see if you look at that industry is an inability to learn, because what we want to do is we want immediate success. What if we don't get that? We will sack the person that's in charge, and when you do that and you bring someone new in, you're essentially throwing away all the learning that person has had in the 3, 4, 5, 6 months that they've been in the role. So you're almost saying, in this job, it's got to be perfect. We cannot learn from mistakes. We cannot take learning forward. You've got to be perfect, which is, when you think about that in a business context, it's absolutely impossible to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, agreed. And yet some of the greatest football managers, the Fergusons of the world, Pep at the moment, they have been long term, and they've seen the fruits of, of everything that you say, that learning and everything that they've done. As a West Ham fan, I was disappointed to see David Moyes go. That wasn't agreed by many on the stands. And having been there on Saturday, there is baying for our manager's head at the moment, as you can probably imagine. But there was baying for David Moyes to go as well. So, I think at the end of the day, but his longevity, his understanding of the DNA of the club, his decision making, which I think, again, if you do that 60%, he got right, 40%, he was a great example, wasn't he, of tenure. I think tenure is important. I also think there's time to go, if that makes sense.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I think you will know that, and I think that's what happens in football, isn't it? And often in organisations, the CEO isn't allowed to work that out, because when is the right time, why is
Yeah.
it the right time, because of all the pressures coming in on results, or I understand succession planning, it's all very sensible, but you have a succession planning conversation within the second year of your career, your CEO career, you're kind of going, oh, okay, well, you're already talking about it. And whilst it's a very practical and very sensible conversation, it doesn't sort of give that sense that everybody's doing it. Well, it doesn't give that sense that actually a CEO probably needs to be there longer than 3 to 5 years, probably. Although that doesn't happen quite so much.
So what helped you to make the decision to move on from Penny Bron then? Because clearly you'd had a good spell there, 6 years or so.
Yep.
What were the factors that helped you to think, right, it's time for me to move on in my career?
So I think for me, I felt I had taken it as far as I could take it as an organisation. And I think I felt that if I wasn't careful, my own personal ambition for the organisation would overtake what it was capable of doing, if that made sense.
Right.
And at that stage, if you had started to go on that kind of, driving, you could have broken something very precious, which was fundamentally it was there to care for people with cancer and look after people with cancer on an individual basis, rather than being a large scale, rolled out, organisation that was working across the NHS, or whatever it was. So for me, once ambition and capability or limitations don't marry, it's probably time for you to go and find somewhere where you can put that ambition into something else.
Leading to Here. For mental models and tools for leaders, visit our YouTube channel, Thinking Focus.
So you moved on then.
Yep.
And you then became CEO of Melanoma UK. Tell us a
Yep.
little about that.
Yeah, so that was fascinating as a job, because I literally took the job in the March, and I can't remember the year, but as we went into the pandemic in the April, as we went into lockdown.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
literally was a virtual CEO in that organisation. I didn't actually meet my staff beyond interview for almost 18 months, I think it was. And not helped by the fact that the central office of Myeloma UK was up in Edinburgh. So not only could I, it wasn't easy anyway, but, so really interesting times, I think, with Myeloma UK, because as with everything, it was all about how did the organisation do the best it possibly could for myeloma patients and people being affected, families being affected by the disease during this very, very difficult time when the pandemic was locking down healthcare fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and I think in terms of that, without going into too much detail, but blood cancer patients had a really difficult time because vaccines weren't working for them because of the treatments that they have, and no one was really paying attention to that. So we're really trying to raise those voices, advocate extremely hard for blood cancer patients. And I work with some great people in the blood cancer community, because blood cancer is not just myeloma, but lymphoma, leukemia, and others, to really try and make that happen. So it was a very particular, specific issue that I had to resolve as a CEO, as a virtual CEO, with a group of people on an incredibly critical and vital piece of healthcare that needed paying attention to. So it was sort of 2 years of intense awareness driving, really, during that period of time.
I bet, clearly you'll know this, the fundraising element of charitable causes across the board, I imagine, was hit really hard during the COVID time.
Different horses for courses, really, Ricky. So what we saw in the general public, obviously events were massively hit. So, London Marathon doesn't happen,
Yeah.
no one's going out and doing these big events. And, the sector does rely heavily on a lot of that events and community activity. But there was some generosity coming from people literally putting their hands in their pockets. And, as I think we saw, there was quite a community feel within the UK that, people were prepared to give you that extra £10 or give you that extra £50, certainly in Myeloma UK, because their families were being affected by it at that time.
Sure.
So those that could did. I think the sector really struggled with government contracts because obviously things weren't happening. So if you were very reliant on big government contracts where things weren't happening, or very reliant on community and events, people really did struggle. But we were very lucky, I think, at Myeloma UK, or the team had done a brilliant job, certainly before I arrived, having very close relationship with its beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries chose to step up during that period.
So you mentioned it was a really intense 2-year period, not eased by the fact that you couldn't actually get to work with the people, face to face that you were trying to do this with. So what sort of toll did that take on you? Not only that we were all going through this pandemic, but you were working very intensely remotely to try and drive a really important campaign. How did you manage your own sort of well-being through that?
That's a really good question. And I think, probably like many CEOs to begin with, the hours were excessive because you were just trying to work out how you were going to do it.
Mm,
I don't think we were good at, or I certainly wasn't, I can't talk for everybody, I wasn't good at the virtual world, because for me, all of a sudden the laptop was at home.
mm,
Therefore, I didn't put those boundaries in between work
mm.
and life. And then also life was a bit mundane. I love my family to bits, but, all of a sudden, spending the whole weekend with nowhere to go and nothing to do, it was far too easy just to go, all right, I'll just flip the laptop open and I'll get some
Yeah,
stuff done. And I think so I didn't manage it at all. We were sort of in this unknown crisis situation. I think I got very obsessed almost, or a bit fixated on checking things all the time. What's happened now? What's happened now? What's happened now?
yeah.
So very fast, very racy, couldn't filter well, not entirely convinced decision making was as optimum as it could be.
Mm,
Um, and so hard, and then you've got your own, crisis
yeah,
going on in terms of family and friends who are being affected, potentially, and then all those horrific pictures on the news about the hospitals and everything else. So
yeah.
It was hard, and it was hard when you've got an inside knowledge of healthcare. Really understanding what
Mm.
clinicians would have been going through, as well as patients. It's sometimes having insider knowledge is not great.
No,
It,
I can imagine. When you know what's happening inside somewhere, that's
yeah,
going to add a layer of concern, I guess, isn't it? And you know how people are feeling and what they're going through.
yeah,
But that's a really interesting take, because we've not quite shifted back to a post-pandemic world, have we, in terms of work? There's still lots of people at home. There's still lots of the boundaries between home and work are still not as clear as they used to be for lots of us. And I don't think it's ever going to be the same, is it?
no. And so I've put my own little contingencies in. I shut the office. I mean, it's not an office. Let's be honest, it's the spare bedroom. But I shut the door
Yeah,
afterwards. To do that, I put discipline in around hours. Uh, I know that sounds slightly strange, but I walk myself to work. So I always walk in the morning. Because that was what I've
yeah,
done for many years. I try to put breaks in. More recently, interestingly, I have been trying to work in different environments. So going to a cafe,
yeah,
just to have some social interaction,
yeah.
outside of just going into the office. So I guess I found walking and different environment bit of variety, a good way of helping with my own kind of
Mm,
mental well-being. But I do work very intently. I can sit at my desk all day and not move easily.
mm.
And that's, I know as a fitness person, exactly what I shouldn't be doing. And, I'm sure like others, my back's not always good, and
Yeah,
my mind can become it's this sort of fix. It's the fact it's always there. So you can. And I think if you're hardworking and,
yeah.
then it's just too easy, really. Um, to move the story on and to give you a little segue, Rich,
Mm,
if that's helpful. During the pandemic, my dad got diagnosed with prostate cancer, or he had
mm,
been diagnosed. He had a reoccurrence, actually.
mm,
And the reason I mention that about is because it's the sort of segue into sort of how I got into Prostate Cancer UK from myeloma, but also I think when I talk about friends and family, Dad was going through his radiotherapy
mm.
at a time when none of us could go and see him. My mum wasn't even allowed into the hospital, so she used to sit outside,
Oh,
reading the paper
wow.
in the car in November, and she's 78, no one
Mm.
could go. So, I think there was that going on. And therefore, it's a very easy answer to your question about why am I where I am now? Because I lived through that as a family member and was very motivated then to try and do something about it.
And my father's going through that as well. He's diagnosed as prostate cancer as well. So
I'm
yeah,
sorry to
we
hear that.
really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, we do, because my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2019. So just prior to the pandemic, all the radiotherapy, going to the hospital, all those kind of things, we were doing that just pre-pandemic as well. So, um, tell us a little more about the wonderful work that you do, and how your leadership journey has evolved working in Prostate Cancer UK.
So Prostate Cancer UK, I think, has been, for me, the first time I am working. So I've always, as you can hear from my story, really believed in healthcare. I've
Mm,
dedicated, if anybody asks me what I've done with my life, I will say, well, I've put it into healthcare to try and make individuals, get the best health that they can, whether that's through their
mm,
well-being, whether that's through medicine, how you put those two things together. And I've advocated for that. And I've worked relentlessly on trying to make that happen. But I've never worked for an organization where I have personally been impacted. So it's been
mm.
really interesting coming into Prostate Cancer UK. I have huge passion for the organisation. I have got a stakeholding actually in what it does, and I need to balance that very carefully. I will say that, because it's very easy to get into, oh, well, this is what happened to Dad, so that's what we need to fix. Where that's not the case. It has to
Yeah,
be about
yeah.
what is happening with men. But in very simple terms, as I said at the beginning, there is a wonderful group of directors. I really have inherited a fantastic organisation, who have been influencing the way prostate cancer is detected, diagnosed and treated, for its 25 years, and it's done some amazing work. in terms of proving things like the MRI scanning to get that into the diagnostic pathway. So men don't go from just a blood test, PSA blood test, straight into a horrible biopsy. There actually is a scan in the middle, and all the work it's done on that. The fact that survivorship in prostate cancer has improved dramatically because of all the work on treatments, and how do we make sure that we get treatments that are really effective but also don't exacerbate side effects for men, which, you know, both incontinence and impotence is really difficult for men psychologically and physically. And so how do we make sure we put the support into that as well as find the right treatments for men? So it's an amazing organisation. As I say, I inherited. I'm a big fan, which I think is important. I don't think people often say that, do they? They feel they have to ambassador their organisations. But actually, I was a big fan of it before I started. It's been an absolute privilege to run it. In terms of the leadership, you know, it's a mid-size, so it's interesting. I've gone through different size and scales of organisations, which means it's a different challenge again in terms of working with the staff and working with the research community, the scientific community, which I've done slightly less of. Research was the bit that was missing from my healthcare career. I've now feel like I've done most of it or all of it, which is great. So I'm still learning on that. But I think in terms of its balance between strategy and action, I think I've helped with that. You know, it's about taking what is strategy and then how do you put that into action, and how do you make things actually happen? Because research is always very long term, and, you know, waiting for 10 years for the biology of the disease to be discovered further is quite difficult to keep people. And I think it's what you were saying earlier, Rick. You were talking about how do you keep people on that longer term? Or when you're working with a research organisation, you have to, because things don't necessarily happen quickly. And so it's a different piece of thinking, a different way of leading.
Laura, we'd just really like to say thank you for giving us your time today. Your time's very valuable, and it's been a fascinating listen and conversation around some of the things that you've learned and put into practice. So we'd thank you very much for your time. We like to end by asking 3 quickfire questions. So you don't have to be one-word answers. You can elaborate a little bit, but the idea is it's relatively quick fire. So are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, number 1. Looking back, what's one thing that you're most proud of?
I think my career in healthcare and all the game-changing things that have happened as a result of me being part of that.
What's one thing that you do differently if you could go back?
I think I would probably hold my ground a little more, particularly in my earlier career, where I think, because I am a collaborator, I would perhaps listen to others and assume that they had a better answer than I did, where sometimes it was probably a little bit more about that stubbornness that I've referenced that I had to learn.
And what's one thing that gives you the energy to keep going?
At this particular juncture, the absolute relentless pursuit of men who are badly served by healthcare in prostate cancer and need a much, much better way of being diagnosed and treated. And, you know, for me, my dad and my son, the generations to come, are absolutely critical, because it doesn't just affect the men, it affects their families and society in general.
Laura, thank you. Ricky, what a fascinating discussion with Laura. What stood out for you?
Well, in reality, far too much than we've got time for here, which is probably a good segue for people to actually listen to the full episode, because it's brilliant.
They were full of little pearls, wasn't it, of things that she's learned for anyone that's leading any team of any sort.
But I felt like I could continue to talk to Laura all day. Clearly, we haven't got the time for that, but we could have literally gone all day. But the first thing that kind of sprung out for me was this 60-40 thing she talked about, which is a bit of advice she'd been given by one of her mentors along the way, which was leadership is about making more calls right than wrong. So if you're in credit in terms of the calls that you get right, then you're perhaps doing a good job, because you can't get everything right. And I think leaders have this pressure to make every decision perfect, and that's never going to happen.
Allowing yourself that acceptance that you are going to get some things wrong, that things are difficult, But as long as you're getting more right than wrong, you're on the right track. And I thought that was really interesting as well, because you can take some comfort in that, can't you? You can relieve some pressure on yourself that you're making the decision with the best information you've got, with the right intent. But you know what? It might not be perfect.
And Laura said that, didn't she? She said once I got that in my head, it kind of freed me up to get on with it, essentially, rather than being constrained by it.
She said as well, and I found one particular thing that she said, it's really important for any leader that you've got congruence, that your words link up with your actions and your behavior, because we probably see in some organizations we've worked with over the years where that's not the case, where leadership are talking about one thing and then they do something completely different, as if the thing they'd said was never said. And that breaks trust, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also chop and change, right? So they go, well, the flavour of today is this, and the flavour, and you go, well, hang on a minute, you said this was the number one priority, and all of a sudden something's happened and we're shifting. And whilst sometimes that might be valid, one of the great examples of the recent past is COVID, clearly, where all bets are off, we do need to rethink. But in the main, that new thinking doesn't necessarily make it the new plan. And I think it's absolutely consistency, congruence, as Laura described it, was you've got to be on point in terms of what you say, but also backing that up with your actions and behaviours. And I think that's absolutely true.
She also mentioned, which is very similar in what you were just saying there, she mentioned the beat of the drum. Keep talking about the key priorities, the key things all the time,
She did.
This beat of the drum. And I suppose maybe the last thing to mention that stood out for me anyway was she said she's discovered that her role is about creating the conditions for people to operate in.
Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious that goes, actually, she was so unassuming in that it's not about me. My job is to get the environment right for everybody else to do their job and to do it well. And the reason we've got those people is because they can do their bit better than I can. So why wouldn't I?
And you said there, it's so obvious, but it's missed. It's missed so often, isn't it, that?
When you think about all of the lessons that we've learned throughout this leading to here, the reality is we say the same thing. Leaders, we get stuck in our own world, in our own minds. We overcomplicate things when actually just make it really simple, make it really clear. What do you want from people? And then support them by creating an environment that allows them to flourish.
Thanks for joining us today. Please share, like and subscribe Leading to Here. We'd be very grateful if you did. If you'd like to know more about us at Thinking Focus, then please drop us a note at hello@thinkingfocus.com or visit thinkingfocus.com online. And join us next time for more insights as we talk to fascinating leaders on Leading to Here.
Leading to Here. For more episodes, visit us at thinkingfocus.com/leading to here.